The postmodern political principle, a belief that society is formed of power and hierarchies, which decide what can be known and how. In postmodernism, knowledge and power are seen as inextricably entwined, most explicitly in Foucault's work, which refers to knowledge as power knowledge. Another French postmodernist, Jean-Francois Leotard, describes a strict interlinkage between the language of science and that of politics and ethics. And another, Jacques Derrida, was interested in the power dynamics of superiority and subordination in language. Similarly, two more, Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari, saw humans as coded within various systems of power and constraint, free to operate only within capitalism and the flow of money. These thinkers argued that the powerful organize society to benefit themselves and help them keep their power, both intentionally and inadvertently. They do this by slanting the way we talk about certain things and creating social rules that are viewed as common sense. Power is constantly reinforced through the discourses that society deems legitimate. Examples include the expectation of civility, reasoned debate, appeals to objective evidence, and even rules of grammar and syntax. For example, simply asking someone to provide evidence and reasoning for their claims, for example that the sun revolves around the earth, or that Captain Marvel is the best Avenger, will be seen as a demand to comply with a system of discourses built by powerful people who valued these approaches and designed them to exclude alternative means of communicating and producing knowledge. In other words, postmodern theory believes science was organized in a way that serves the interests of the powerful people who established it, white Western men, and bars others from participating. In Marxist theory, power is believed to be enforced from the top onto those at the bottom. In postmodern theory, power permeates all levels of society and gets reinforced by everyone through routine interactions, expectations, and social conditioning. It's the social system and its inherent power dynamics that are seen as the causes of oppression. The individuals involved don't necessarily have to hold a single oppressive view. As well, the system of oppression isn't seen as a consciously coordinated patriarchal white supremacist heteronormative conspiracy. Instead, postmodern theory sees this operation as the inevitable result of self-perpetuating systems that privilege some groups over others. The postmodernist view looks like a conspiracy theory, but one without conspirators, since there are no coordinated actors pulling the strings. Because they focus on self-perpetuating systems of power, few of the original postmodern theorists advocated any specific political actions, preferring instead to playfully disrupt or indulge in pessimistic despair. They didn't really believe meaningful change was possible. Nevertheless, the overtly left-wing idea that oppressive power structures constrain humanity runs throughout postmodernism. This implies an ethical duty to deconstruct, challenge, problematize, find and exaggerate the problems within, and resist ways of thinking that support power and the language that perpetuates it. Foucault was explicit about the ever-present danger of oppressive systems. My point is not that everything is bad, but that everything is dangerous, which is not exactly the same as bad. If everything is dangerous, then we always have something to do. So, my position leads not to apathy, but to a hyper and pessimistic activism. I think that the ethico-political choice we have to make every day is to determine which is the main danger. The postmodern approach to social critique is to make their ideas intangible, because then they're unfalsifiable. That is, they can't be disproved. Due to postmodernism's rejection of objective truth and reason, it can't be argued with. The postmodern perception, Leotard writes, makes no claim to be true. Quote, "Our hypothesis should not be accorded predictive value in relation to reality, but strategic value in relation to the question raised." End quote. Postmodern theory seeks to be strategically useful in bringing about its own aims, not factually true about reality. This leads to the four main themes: the blurring of boundaries, the power of language, cultural relativism, and the loss of the individual and the universal in favor of group identity.
All right. Okay, so this is the postmodern political principle, the belief that society is formed of power and hierarchies which decide what can be known and how. So this is different from the knowledge principle, because the knowledge principle is there's no objective truth. You can't really know anything, and everything is socially constructed. And this is the political principle, which basically says that powerful forces shape society in order to maintain their power. And the implication there is that you have to always look at the position of yourself and anyone making any claims in relation to power to find where that power is exerting its influence to maintain itself. I think this is where that cynicism really takes hold.
Yep, it's flowing through us right now. It's flowing through this book right now. We're all Agent Smith in the moment, trying to reinforce the trap that everybody's in. And there's an inherent belief that we're all in a trap and don't realize it.
You've used that, we've been talking, you used that before, that we're all Agent Smith. What do you mean by that? I'm curious.
Like whenever we start talking about reinforcing hegemony, as Foucault might have put it, like when we sit here and we're advocating for maintaining any part of liberalism, as soon as we jump into that, this is part of their idea. They don't want to blame any single one person. It's just when I start talking like that, I suddenly morph into Agent Smith. You know how he does in the movie, that any one person can be a person. They can be their person when everything's political, but they might be a person when you're playing the guitar or getting a steak. But then when I start talking to you to reinforce these ideas, I morph into Agent Smith, and I'm just regurgitating the system at you.
Oh, I hear that.
The Matrix is a system, Neo. That system is our enemy. But when you're inside, you look around, what do you see? Businessmen, teachers, lawyers, carpenters, the very minds of the people we are trying to save. But until we do, these people are still a part of that system, and that makes them our enemy. You have to understand, most of these people are not ready to be unplugged. And many of them are so inert, so hopelessly dependent on the system, that they will fight to protect it. Were you listening to me, Neo? Or were you looking at the woman in the red dress? I was. Look again. Freeze it.
This isn't the Matrix?
No. It's another training program designed to teach you one thing. If you are not one of us, you are one of them. That anyone we haven't unplugged is potentially an agent. But they are the gatekeepers. They are guarding all the doors, they are holding all the keys, which means that sooner or later, someone is going to have to fight them.
What's so weird is that in my head, I consider the world that these people seem to be pulling us into or want us to be in as to be the oppressive totalitarian world. And so I see them trying to convey it to me and impose it on me as Agent Smith. This is where we start to really get into the nitty and gritty of how language can be used as a weapon or as a cage or as whatever metaphor you want to use to say that it can be used to maintain power. And we're introduced to some names that really leave that footprint on the movement. So the first one is going to be Jean-Francois Leotard. And let's take a look at the profile that Helen Pluckrose gave us for him.
In his groundbreaking book, The Postmodern Condition, Jean-Francois Leotard defined postmodernism as a skepticism towards meta-narratives. By this, he meant that all the large, overarching stories we told ourselves about how society worked and the meaning of life were becoming less credible. Another description of meta-narratives are that they're historically and culturally situated narratives which nevertheless are presented as universal. Leotard included Christianity and Marxism in his understanding of meta-narratives, but he also included science. As is typical of postmodernists, his work focused intensely on the power of language. He saw this in terms of different kinds of games which legitimated knowledge. He claimed that the language of science was inseparable from the language of power and government. Rather than these big meta-narratives, he argued, we need lots of mini-narratives. Rather than authoritative knowledge legitimized by scientific methods, we need a paralogy of legitimation. That is, we need multiple knowledges with none prized over any other. This is moral and factual relativism.
All right. That fits very nicely in with both the knowledge principle and the political principle, because if there is no objective truth and everything is an expression of power, and that power is expressed through language and the use of language, then it all ties together quite conveniently. Anything else on that profile of Leotard that we just saw?
He was like the person who maybe did the best job of giving like the general overview of he had the book called The Postmodern Condition. So you can turn to him just to be the one who did give the postmodernists acceptable definition of what the whole entire thing is.
Yeah. And that grand skepticism of meta-narratives, it lies at the root of all of it, because if you're disregarding truth or the pursuit of truth or objective reality, then that encompasses a huge thing that they'll call a meta-narrative. And so many of these things that they are identifying and classifying, there's some truth to it. You can point to those systems of thought, which are composed of a bunch of interconnected ideas that shape how we see the world and how we understand that it operates. And if you call them a meta-narrative, just naming them doesn't automatically imply that there is no utility to one or that one is not more effective than the other in certain dimensions of society. And that's where that constructivism and that relativism accompany this idea of meta-narratives to blow apart the idea that there's any right way to view the world.
I think the reason I'm here on this and have been trying to talk to people forever about it is I think it's worth knowing. I think everybody should be knowing and understanding that we're in a position of such skepticism, such things. And I've been talking to a couple people about this stuff, and as I talk to them, they really get into Derrida and they really get into Foucault, and maybe for artistic reasons or whatnot. There's plenty about them that's interesting, that's worth thinking about, but everybody needs to know it. Everybody needs to know that it's part of what's being, in a Foucauldian way, the new episteme that's getting pushed down upon us. If we can use his language, which very often you can if you start getting into it.
Yeah. All right, let's take a look at what she has to say about Jacques Derrida.
For Jacques Derrida, the focus was even more intensely on language. He was radically skeptical of the possibility of ever conveying meaning by language. For him, words only referred to other words, so meaning is indefinitely deferred. House is understandable in relation to hut and mansion. Derrida also believed that words are used comparatively to give one term superiority to another. That is, men are defined as not being women and also as superior to women. He advocated ironically reversing these binaries to make them visible and challenge power hierarchies. This can be benign enough and quite poignant. I myself have been known to replace the world and his wife with the world and her husband. But it can also go to quite a dark place. If your conception of society is one in which women and racial and sexual minorities are constantly subjected to discrimination and abuse, and then you want to reverse that binary, you are likely to end up with sexism against men, racism against white people, and for this to be morally justifiable as a kind of redressing the balance. This takes a step away from objectivity and towards subjectivity. It also undermines the reasonable person standard upon which much law and judicial decision is based.
Fighting racism with racism.
And so is it any surprise that we see the practical application of some of these ideas come from law schools, where the medium of law is language, and the written language in particular, because that is the way that we hold our self and society accountable for the things that we've established as our legal norms and standards.
I jokingly said fighting racism with racism, but it's what they do. And they've got this way, and I'm sure Chris could explain it better, but of like doing a thing, like obviously doing a thing, but claiming that they're not doing that thing. So they take it and they fight racism with racism, but then they set up the rules and change definitions of words to where, no, we're not actually doing that. Discrimination against white people might be prejudice, but it's not racist. It just goes back to D'Angelo and her messed up definitions of racism.
Well, I feel like what we're doing with words and language here has a parallel with what we did with the concept of truth, where if you start out by just saying there's no objective truth, there's no way we can actually understand truth, then it frees you up to conceive of all different notions of truth as being equal. And so then you just choose the ones that are most effective politically. And So here, if you say no words can actually convey real meaning, and the idea that you have an intentionality combined with the conventional usage of the words to convey meaning is itself a dream, then suddenly you've now turned a solid, concrete word and the ideas that it convey into a cloud of possibilities that you can then extract, manipulate, and maneuver to achieve whatever your political goal is. And so you combine these two things together and you have this phenomenal toolkit for both disguising your true intentions, for demonizing your adversaries by warping and distorting what they say in order to turn the mob against them. And you can also say something that you understand will be taken one way by those who are true believers and know your end goals, and may be tolerated by people who, if they understood what you were truly conveying, wouldn't be so keen to let you into those positions of power and influence.
That exact question, more chapters, like later chapters are going to get into it, but to see how Foucault and Derrida play on it is, we're not attacking white people, we're attacking the construct of whiteness. And the construct of whiteness is defined by what is not white. And that's Derrida. And the whiteness is obviously superior to what is not white. And the construct just comes from a system, and the system as it was developed to help and be something that's beneficial just for the ones who fit inside of that construct. And so they get around it all by putting these extra academic layers to it to say, no, we're doing this other thing, not the racism as you view it.
And that's where they are free to redefine words in real time in order to achieve those ends. And because there's this background of these academic philosophers who have justified the real-time redefinition of words to suit political ends, then it seems as a legitimate exercise whenever Webster's dictionary or whatever online dictionary decides to update the definition to reflect how it's been used to make a particular political point or been pushed back against.
And then there's a level of, if you get irritated at that plays towards our ends. That's some Marxist conflict theory. So if you get irritated and then you didn't understand our exact, very specific definition of it that we've construed around using all these philosophers, but you take it more directly and concretely like that and get irritated at that. First off, we've got the conflict theory where we've got the two different classes starting to fight each other. And the result of that's going to get us to a place of utopia. But the flip end of it too is that it proves the Kafka trap. It proves the Kafka trap, the Kafka trap.
This word is unusual, so we need to define it better. The Kafka Trap. The term Kafka Trap derives from a book called The Trial, written by Franz Kafka. In the story, an ordinary man wakes up one day to find himself accused of a crime he did not commit, a crime whose nature is never revealed to him. His attempts to defend himself and establish his innocence only serve to prove his guilt in the totalitarian legal system of his world.
Joseph K. Joseph K. You are Joseph K.
Yes?
You're an accused man.
So I've been informed?
Your case is going badly.
My first petition hasn't been offered yet.
For the present, your guilt is assumed to have been proved.
But I'm not guilty. For that matter, how can any man be called guilty? We're all simply men here, one as much as the other.
The guilty always talk like that.
A no-win manipulation could be defined as the act of putting targets in situations where all actions lead to a negative outcome. An example would be what's called a Kafka trap. In Kafka traps, targets are accused typically of some psychological flaw. When they deny the accusation, their denial is taken as evidence that the accusation is true. The possibility that the accusation is false is invalidly excluded. Targets of Kafka traps are only presented with losing options by their accuser. In fact, in many cases, targets do have positive options. One is to simply ignore their accusers. Another is to expose and mock this fallacious manipulation.
Robin DiAngelo, New York Times bestselling author of the book White Fragility, is famous for bringing the Kafka Trap to the forefront with the concept of white fragility. Essentially, the concept is that when white people get offended because you call them racist, their offense at that accusation is proof that the accusation is true.
The flip end of it is that it proves the Kafka Trap, the Angelo Kafka Trap that you talked about. You got irritated about it. Uh-oh, you got to work on you.
Then as soon as you get irritated about it, they respond with a gif of you and the point going over your head. Yeah.
But the double meaning is still there. And then you come across any given practitioner and that person themselves might not understand all this. And then they just go straight to white people. And they didn't do all the work in the background to understand the whole constructs coming out of postmodernism.
Well, that you do the work thing, that's what gets me irritated. I will ask, what's an example of your oppression? And be like, wow, you don't know already? You should have known this. Don't ask an oppressed person to do the footwork for you.
Then frequently with those situations, I'll push back and show them that I've done the work and ask them if they've read it. And they usually haven't. You go work. But
no, you've done the work of what? Reading a bunch of white guys talk about it. They have a lived experience that's more authentic and legitimate than that.
And that's even come up. Foucault has literally been canceled for those reasons, because they're looking too much at the ideas of European white males. So we need to slowly move them out of the theory.
The lived experience also bothers the hell out of me because the way that I'm pretty sure it was in White Fragility that she explains lived experience is that basically you have to listen to their lived experience as somebody who's higher on the ladder of hierarchy of oppression. They could look at you and they can already have a good idea of what your lived experience is. They know what your life is, but you can't look down. It's that whole punching up, punching down thing. They understand you. You don't understand them. Therefore, you have to listen to them and take everything they say as fact. They do not have to do the same for you, though. You can't claim, I feel oppressed because of my lived experience. They can just denounce that outright because of your identity.
This is the part where you get in a lot of struggles arguing with people, because a pure postmodernist would argue that came later as a construct of the applied postmodernists, who then did their own ranking and came up with their own reasons for why you can land on an objective truth based off of the structural determinism of what, those are all different words, but their oppression is what gives them official truth and official knowledge. So that inverts the hierarchy. It puts a hierarchy to it, which already the postmodernists wouldn't be down with, but it inverts it. It puts the opposite, that supposedly the people in power can never understand, but the people down at the bottom, they have a lived experience that gives them, all the way back to W.E.B. Du Bois, they called it like a double consciousness, like that they have the ability to see and have viewed the world as a person that somebody from the other class, maybe Derrida would say it, the binary that's the higher level of the definition, they'll never be able to understand it. They'll never be able to see and have the experiences to grasp it.
I feel like you're talking about a postmodernism's applied term, where if you take pure postmodern theory, it is nihilistic, because if you say that everything's culturally constructive, nothing's really true, then there's no point in affecting change, because what are you going to affect change on? If everything is a socially constructed thing that's no one is better than the other, then there's no point in changing one to the other. And it leads to that nihilistic space. And they point to later philosophers or later theorists, like I think in particular Kimberly Crenshaw, who does this applied turn, which gives it a direction, gives it something solid on which to move for change. And they make the case that we'll learn later on, and that is oppression. Yeah. But they point to a quote from Foucault, which actually does give a sort of direction. It's just that rather than defining it as oppression, he defines it as danger. But when you look at where he's talking about powerful systems that, I don't know if he uses the word oppress in his original text, but when they label people mad or people crazy, or when they incarcerate people, those are manifestations of power imposed on people, when from his perspective, there's no absolute truth, there's no good and evil, there's no right or wrong. And so those are doing an injustice to those people. And so they are experiencing something dangerous from the sources of power And so that is a form of oppression. And so that then gives you some reason to act, which is to push back against the danger of these powerful forces maintaining themselves in your society and I guess putting you under their boot.
Man, it's a long critique of postmodernism that they don't really hold to that flatness of all things as much as they like to. And that kind of pops up in this, in the sense of they do ultimately hint at the marginalized or the ones put underneath need to be elevated up. But they would have been more universal about it in any sort of situation. But the whole entire concept of intersectionality came out from the idea of, hey, postmodernists say we can deconstruct race. That's just a social construct. Intersectionality came out of, no, that's the one. No, now you can't. Stop right there. And the reason it can't is because oppression. So oppression becomes one of the only things on this whole planet that can create real truth that can't be deconstructed. So that's why you get the oppression Olympics. That's why oppression becomes a substrate of truth.
Yeah. And that's also why it becomes a term and a concept that the more you can expand it, the more sway, influence, power, or footing that you have to do what it is that you aim to do politically. Because it's that truth of oppression that then justifies the actions that you take. And if you believe a system is upholding that oppression, then what you do to dismantle and abolish that system is a form of justice. And it's a form of liberation. And that then becomes the moral fuel to your actions. Okay. So we've talked about these two principles, the postmodern knowledge principle. There's no objective truth. Everything is socially constructed. Nothing's better than the other. And then the postmodern power principle, which is that society is formed of powers and hierarchies, and they enforce and maintain their power through the use of language. And they decide what can be known and how. And so we've touched on some themes that weave in and out of both of those that the book is now going to name and discuss. And I think it'll be easier to have a fuller conception of exactly what's going on once we've gone through these four principles. So if there's nothing else, let's go ahead and take a listen now.